Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, everyone. We're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff today.
Always exciting to be here.
We've gotten some great suggestions from listeners about Rabindranath Tagore. And, well, he's a pretty major figure in literature and art. A true giant, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. His impact is undeniable.
One thing that really stood out to me when I was reading up on him was this anecdote from Rabindranath Tagore, The Myriad-Minded Man. It's by Krishna, Dutta, and Andrew Robinson.
Oh, I think I know the one you mean.
So Tagore's at this social gathering, right? And he sees a young woman he's never met before.
Okay, I'm listening.
And just like that, on the spot, he composes a song about her.
Wow, talk about a first impression.
Yeah, and apparently the young woman was quite embarrassed by the whole thing.
I can imagine. That's quite a way to be introduced.
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely makes you think about his creative process, doesn't it? It seems like he was very impulsive, totally in tune with his surroundings, maybe even a little overwhelming to those around him.
You know, it's almost like that creative spark, that outpouring of art just took over. It makes you wonder if it comes at a price.
That's an interesting thought.
Like, was there something deeper going on?
Well, that's what we're here to explore, isn't it? The link between genius and, well, the mad part of Mad Genius.
Right. And when I was looking at the source material, I noticed Tagore seemed to have a tough time with formal education.
Really? Tell me more.
Well, he went to 4 different schools. And, according to Dutta and Robinson, he absolutely hated all of them. Just couldn't stand it.
That's interesting. I'm sensing a theme here. It does seem like a lot of highly creative individuals have that same experience, that rejection of traditional education.
It's like being forced into a system that doesn't fit their way of thinking.
Exactly. A rigid system that stifles their creativity. It's actually described as a misery for Tagore by Dutta and Robinson. It's on page 57.
And they say that this dislike of academia stuck with him his whole life.
Makes you wonder what was behind it, right?
Yeah. Was it just a brilliant mind clashing with convention? Or could it be something more?
Possibly. It's a question worth considering. Could this aversion to traditional learning point to something deeper, maybe linked to unconventional thinking or even some mental and emotional complexities?
It's certainly a possibility.
I mean, we do see this pattern throughout history. Creative individuals often struggle to conform, they question everything, see the world differently. It makes you wonder, is it just a personality trait? Or is it something more profound, something rooted in their psychology?
Right. Is it nature or nurture? Or, well, a combination of both.
And it's fascinating that Tagore even kept his distance from intellectual authority later in life. Even when he was working with scholars, there was this hesitation. Dutta and Robinson mentioned this on page 59.
You know, it almost seems like that sense of being an outsider, of not quite belonging, might have fueled his creativity.
Now, that's a thought-provoking idea. Like, he needed that tension to ignite his imagination.
Exactly. It's like the friction sparked something incredible.
That's a compelling theory. But I think there's another important piece of this puzzle we need to look at before we go too far down that road.
Oh, and what's that?
Well, we need to talk about Kadambari Devi, Tagore's sister-in-law. Her story is a real tragedy.
Kadambari Devi, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really sad story. And it seems like she was so much more than just his sister-in-law.
Their relationship was definitely complicated, and there's a lot we still don't know about it, unfortunately.
It almost seems like she was a muse to him.
Yeah, you could say that. But what we do know for sure is that her suicide really affected him deeply.
It happened just a few years after Tagore got married, right?
That's right.
I can't even imagine what he must have gone through emotionally.
It must have been devastating.
And Dutta and Robinson talk about how there wasn't a clear reason for her death. No one really knows why. It's on page 90.
Right. It's still a bit of a mystery.
That kind of unresolved grief, you know, that lingering question of why. It seems like that would almost fuel someone's creative expression.
It definitely could. It makes sense, doesn't it?
Like maybe he channeled all of those feelings, his grief, his confusion, into his work.
It's very possible. And you know, Dutta and Robinson actually suggest that her presence can be felt in a lot of his poetry and painting, even after her death. They talk about it on page 91.
Wow, that's powerful.
There are these recurring themes of absence and longing that seem to echo her death.
It's almost like he was trying to keep her memory alive through his art.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it, to deal with the pain of her loss by creating something beautiful and lasting.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It might even be one of the things that makes a true artist. You know, to be able to take personal suffering and make it relatable to everyone, to create something that touches people across time and cultures.
That's a really interesting thought.
So moving on a little bit, I think we should talk about Tagore's views on Western culture. There's some interesting contradictions there.
Yeah, I noticed that in the source material, too.
Oh, good.
He was really drawn to Western culture at first,
Mm.
especially when he was in England. Dutta and Robinson talk about it on pages 67 through 77 of Rabindranath Tagore, The Myriad-Minded Man. It was like he was captivated by this new world, new ideas.
It was a time of great intellectual and cultural ferment in Europe, lots of exciting new ideas floating around.
Exactly. And he was exposed to all of this new literature, philosophy, even scientific advancements.
It must have been quite a change from his life in India.
Definitely. But then, as he got older and saw what colonialism was really like, his perspective changed.
Yeah, it shifted pretty dramatically.
He became a big critic of imperialism,
Yeah.
and he actually renounced his knighthood to protest what Britain was doing in India.
It was a powerful statement.
It was. Yeah. And Dutta and Robinson talk about that on pages 217 to 219.
Right. So the question is, how do we make sense of these two seemingly opposite views?
It's hard to reconcile them, isn't it?
It's a tough one. Was it some kind of inner conflict, this ideological battle he was having with himself?
It almost makes you wonder.
Some people think that his views just evolved naturally over time.
Well, that makes sense, doesn't it?
As he understood the world better and how power, culture, and identity all intersect.
Yeah, and especially seeing firsthand how colonialism was hurting his own people and their culture. It would change anyone's perspective.
Absolutely. It would be a powerful experience for someone as sensitive and aware of social justice as Tagore.
Exactly. But, it's interesting. His critique of the West wasn't like a total rejection of everything Western.
Oh, that's a good point.
He still appreciated some aspects of European thought and culture.
Right. It wasn't just black and white.
It's more like he recognized the good and the bad and tried to find a way forward that respected both his heritage and the broader human experience.
That's a really good way to describe it.
It's about understanding that things are complicated
Yeah.
and recognizing that progress and enlightenment often come with a price, and that it's important to use your voice to speak out against injustice.
Exactly. And speaking of using his voice, we have to talk about Tagore's activism. He was really passionate about social and political issues.
So we've talked a lot about Tagore's life, and it's definitely been a fascinating journey.
It really has. Full of ups and downs, contradictions, triumphs, and tragedies. A true testament to the complexities of the human experience, I'd say.
For sure. But I think we need to talk more about his creative work, too. That's what really cemented his legacy.
Right. His writing and his art are truly remarkable.
But it's almost overwhelming where to even start. I mean, the guy wrote thousands of poems, dozens of plays, novels, short stories, essays.
He even composed over 2,000 songs.
It's mind-boggling.
It is. But I think one way to approach his vast body of work is to, look for those connections to his life, those recurring themes that pop up again and again, the things that clearly resonated with him.
Like echoes of his experiences.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So, for example, we talked about Kadambari Devi's death and how deeply it affected him.
Right, a tragic event that clearly left a mark on him.
Do you think we can see that reflected in his poetry or music?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of scholars point to the collection Manasi. It was published just a few years after she died.
Interesting.
And the poems in that collection, they have this very haunting quality to them. This sense of longing and introspection that seems to reflect his inner turmoil.
It's like he was working through his grief through his writing.
Exactly. And that's where it gets interesting when we think about creativity and, madness.
Right.
It's not about saying that mental illness is romantic or anything, but it's about understanding that art can be incredibly powerful for processing trauma, for exploring those dark parts of the human psyche.
To find beauty in pain.
Exactly. And we talked about Tagore's changing views on the West, too, how he went from embracing it to being disillusioned by imperialism.
Right. A real shift in perspective.
And that also comes up in his work, for sure.
Where do you see that most clearly?
His novel Gora is a great example.
What's that one about?
Well, it's a complex story, for sure.
Okay.
But basically, it deals with identity, nationalism, and the clash between tradition and modernity during colonial India. A lot to unpack there.
There is. But the main character, Gora, he's raised as a Hindu nationalist. And then he finds out that he's actually of Irish descent. His parents were Irish.
Whoa, that's a huge twist.
It is. And it forces him to completely reevaluate everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world.
So it's about more than just history,
Way more. It's really a deep dive into the human psyche.
about the anxieties of a society going through these massive changes.
Exactly, and trying to figure out its identity under colonial rule. And the interesting thing is, Gora doesn't give you easy answers.
Oh, I like that.
Tagore gives you different perspectives. He wants the reader to really think critically about their own biases and the complexities of this society in transition.
So he's challenging us.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes his work so powerful. It's not just about pretty language or entertaining stories. It's about using art to make a statement, to make us think about ourselves and society, to push the boundaries of what we think is possible.
He wasn't afraid to ask the tough questions. Not at all. And he does all of this with a mastery of language that's just incredible.
You can tell he put a lot of thought into every word.
He blends poetry and prose, uses music and drama, always trying new things.
He was a true innovator.
Yeah.
Never content to stay in one place, always pushing the boundaries.
It's that creative energy, that restless spirit. It's really what we associate with the mad genius idea.
It's like he couldn't be limited by any one genre or style.
Right, he needed to keep exploring and challenging himself.
And challenging his audience, too.
Exactly. And I think that's a great lesson for all of us, whether we're artists or not. It's about staying curious, about pushing ourselves outside our comfort zones and not being afraid of the unknown.
To always be learning and growing.
Creativity isn't about reaching a destination. It's about the journey.
I love that.
Right.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Rabindranath Tagore, what's the one thing you really want listeners to take away from all of this?
That's a good question. I think the biggest lesson we can learn from Tagore is to embrace our complexities, to really understand that brilliance, genius often comes from unexpected places.
Out of hardship and struggle.
Exactly. It's about finding the beauty in imperfection. It's about finding your voice and using it to challenge the status quo.
To speak out against injustice.
Yes, and to make the world a more compassionate and just place.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you for joining us on the Mad Genius Thesis. We hope you found this exploration of Rabindranath Tagore's life and work as inspiring as we did. Remember, embrace your own mad genius and use your unique gifts to make the world a better, brighter place.